This parking lot is essential for the farm's future. It will bring new opportunities.
I understand it is a change.
A necessary change. The old fence is gone, but this brings progress.
One morning in late September, right when the Georgia heat was finally starting to lose its grip, and the red clay was still damp from the night before, an old man named Gene Wilkins stepped out onto his back porch with a cup of black coffee and noticed something that made his jaw tighten in a way it hadn't tightened in years. There was fresh asphalt where his fence used to be, dark and new and gleaming in the sunrise, with bright white painted lines and maybe 40 or 50 parking spaces cut right through land that had belonged to his family since 1947. Land his father had bought with money saved from the war, land that had been officially surveyed and platted and recorded in the county courthouse with a stamp and a signature that was older than Gene himself. Gene Wilkins was the kind of man you didn't notice much if you passed him on the road. 71 years old, lean as a hoe handle, weathered the way things get weathered when they've been exposed to Georgia sun and Georgia rain for 7 decades without complaining. He wore a faded John Deere cap, the bill curved just so, and he moved slowly, but with a purpose that suggested he knew exactly where he was going and why. His hands were big and calloused, the kind of hands that had worked dirt and fixed machinery and mended fences so many times the motions were automatic as breathing. He'd been married to his wife Pearl for 43 years, and they had 3 grown children and 5 grandchildren, and Gene had spent nearly every morning of those 71 years doing more or less the same thing, waking up early, stepping out onto the porch, and looking at the land that meant everything to him. Now, the thing about Gene was that he wasn't a man who rushed to anger. He'd learned a long time ago that most situations had a way of working themselves out if you didn't make them worse by losing your temper right off. So instead of marching down to the fence line and hollering at whoever had done this, he just stood there on the porch with his coffee getting cold in his hands, studying the situation. Pearl came out a few minutes later, wrapped in her old blue robe, and she took one look at the asphalt and said, "Gene, what on earth is that?" And he shook his head slow and said, "That, Pearl, is a problem we're about to have to deal with." The land he was looking at stretched out about 85 acres, give or take. His grandfather had bought the original plot from a timber company back in 1947, right after coming home from the Pacific. The old man, Gene's grandfather, Chester Wilkins, had come back to Georgia with nothing but a uniform, a discharge papers, and an idea that he wanted to own something. He'd saved money from his military pay, borrowed a little from the bank, and found this piece of property that had been logged over and left rough. He'd walked those acres with a county surveyor in the fall of that year, and they'd marked out the boundaries, driven stakes into the ground, and filed the original plat map down at the courthouse in Madison County. Chester had paid for that survey himself, $150, which was serious money in 1947. That map was hand-drawn on cream-colored paper, careful as a physician's handwriting, showing every line and every boundary in black ink, with compass directions marked clear and distances measured and notated. The surveyor had signed it, Harold Pritchard, certified and registered. The county clerk had stamped it. It was as official as anything gets, the kind of document that stands up in court, that tells the truth about where something begins and where it ends. Gene's father had kept that farm going, added to it over the years, and when Gene inherited it at 32 years old, it was the most valuable thing in the world to him. Not because of money, though it had provided for his family just fine, but because of what it represented. It was proof that the Wilkins men had worked, had succeeded in building something, had a place in the world that was theirs by law and by effort. Gene had raised his kids on that land. He'd taught his oldest boy to drive on those dirt roads. He'd brought Pearl here as a young bride, and they'd built their house on the highest spot, where you could look out across the pastures in any direction. He'd buried his father in the little cemetery on the east side of the property, right next to his grandfather Chester. The burial ground went back 3 generations by the time Gene was in his 60s. That land wasn't just land to Gene. It was family history written in red clay and fence posts and the graves of people he loved. You don't let people build parking lots on ground like that. You just don't. The HOA subdivision had shown up about 7 years earlier, right along the southern border of Gene's property. Before that, it had been more forest and scattered farms, places where you could own 90 acres and your nearest neighbor might be a quarter mile away. But a developer from Atlanta had seen potential for retirement homes and small residential lots, and they'd bought up 300 acres and carved it into 87 little plots, and built a community center with a swimming pool and called it Whispering Pines, which Gene thought was a pretty name for something that would turn out to be such a headache. The Whispering Pines HOA started off simple enough. There was a president, a fellow named Davis, who seemed decent enough. There was a board of 5 people, and there was Karen Wexler, who came on as treasurer and somehow ended up running the whole thing through sheer force of will and a voice that had a way of talking down to people like they were children. Karen was a woman in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with blonde hair that was clearly a dye job, but she wore it like it was natural as sun. And she had a habit of showing up places in a blazer and heels even on Saturday mornings. She carried a clipboard like it was a badge of authority. Now, none of that would have mattered much to Gene. He didn't socialize with the subdivision folks much anyway. Pearl would sometimes mention at the grocery store that this neighbor or that neighbor seemed nice enough, and Gene would nod and go about his business. He wasn't antisocial exactly, just private, the kind of old farmer who believed in a firm handshake and not much else. But in the early fall of this year, about 5 months back from the day Gene saw the asphalt, the HOA had decided they needed more parking. The community center was hosting events, the pool was popular, and on weekends, the lots got full. So instead of expanding the community center, parking on their own property, or instead of asking the people who use the facilities to park more responsibly, they decided to build a second lot. And they decided to build it on Gene's land, without asking, without so much as a phone call. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the HOA Trap, because what happens next in this story is exactly why you check the property lines before you pour concrete. Gene figured out what had happened by talking to his neighbor, Tom Finch, who lived about a mile east and who'd seen the construction company coming and going. Tom was a talker, a good-hearted man who'd lived in the area most of his life, and he came by one afternoon to let Gene know what he'd seen. It was a Tuesday, hot still, and Tom came around by the side of the house where Gene was working on the screen door of the back porch. "Gene," Tom said, "I don't mean to butt in on something that's not my business, but I think you need to know what's happening over at that subdivision." Gene set down his screwdriver and listened while Tom told him about the equipment, the grading, the way the construction crews had moved in and started working on something that looked awful close to where Gene's property line ought to be. "They had equipment over there day before yesterday," Tom said, "and I watched them grade it out, and I thought it looked awful close to your line, so I wanted to make sure you knew what was going on." Gene thanked Tom with a firm handshake. That was how they did things, no big embrace, just a shake and a nod, and Tom headed back to his truck. That's when Gene decided to take a walk down to the back of the property to see it up close, and he asked Pearl if she wanted to come along, but Pearl said she had to get dinner started, so Gene walked it alone, his boots crunching on the red clay, the smell of Georgia earth and pine coming up with every step. The sight of it struck him different up close than it had from the porch. It wasn't just asphalt and lines. His old fence was gone, completely gone, the posts yanked out and tossed in a pile like kindling, the fencing wire coiled up like a dead snake. The smell of fresh asphalt hung in the air, sharp and chemical, cutting through the natural smell of the red clay and the pines. In about 30 years, Gene had built and maintained that fence. He'd done it himself, mostly, with his oldest boy helping in the beginning. They'd set the posts together on a Saturday in the spring of 1965, Gene mixing the concrete while his boy held the posts level, and they'd run the wire tight and secured it proper. The posts were treated timber, expensive. Gene remembered paying $45 for a truckload back then. Set deep in concrete so they'd last through decades of Georgia weather, sun and rain, and the occasional ice storm. And now they were just scattered lumber in a heap, some of them still with concrete still stuck to the base. The fence had run in a perfectly straight line, marked not just by the posts, but by the property survey stakes his grandfather had planted in 1947. Little metal markers with W stamped on them for Wilkins, placed at intervals along the boundary, exactly 50 feet apart. Gene had maintained those markers, cleared around them, made sure they stayed visible and in place. Those stakes were gone too, buried under asphalt, or maybe pulled out and discarded like they were nothing. Gene stood at the edge of the parking lot, looking at where his fence used to be, and something in his chest tightened. Not anger, not yet, but a kind of recognition that something had fundamentally changed. Someone had taken it upon themselves to erase a boundary that wasn't theirs to erase. They'd destroyed property, they'd made an assumption that cost money and effort, and that assumption was wrong. And the worst part was, they'd done it so casually, like erasing somebody's property line was no different than painting parking spaces. He called Pearl down to look at it, and she walked slowly along the edge of the asphalt, shaking her head. They didn't say much. They just stood there together in the late afternoon sun, looking at what used to be their fence, and Pearl reached over and squeezed Jean's arm, and that was enough. 2 days later, a woman in a blazer and heels showed up at Jean's front door during his morning coffee. It was Karen Wexler, with her clipboard tucked under her arm, like it gave her some kind of official standing. Pearl answered the door. Jean was still on the porch, but he could hear every word through the screen. Karen didn't bother with much preamble. She said, "I'm here on behalf of the Whispering Pines HOA to inform you that the parking lot that's been constructed on the southern side of your property is now HOA community property, and we're going to need you to remove any personal equipment, livestock, or structures from that area immediately." Pearl came onto the porch, and Jean stood up slowly, real slow, the way he did when he was buying time. He looked at Karen, really looked at her, and then he said, "Now see, the thing about that parking lot is, it's not on my property. It's on my property. That land is mine. My grandfather bought it and surveyed it and filed papers on it in 1947. So what you're telling me is that your HOA built a parking lot on somebody else's property without asking and without checking, and now you want to come tell me about it like I should just accept that situation." Karen's face got a little pink around the edges. She said, "That's not how it is. The developer told us the lot was available, and we constructed it according to specifications. You're not being cooperative about community planning." Jean said, "I'll tell you what I am, ma'am. I'm a man who knows where his property ends and where it begins, because my grandfather paid money for a surveyor to figure that out 76 years ago. And I'm a man who expects other people to respect that. What I'm not going to do is cooperate with people trespassing on my land." Karen went stiff. She said something about how the HOA had legal counsel and they would be in touch, and then she turned around and walked back to her car, her heels clicking on the concrete like she was angry at the ground itself. Pearl came over and put her hand on Jean's shoulder, and Jean just shook his head. "It's not over," he said to Pearl. "When something goes this wrong, when somebody makes this big a mistake this publicly, they don't usually just back down and apologize." He was right. 3 days later, Jean got a registered letter from the HOA's lawyer. It was a formal notice demanding that he stop interfering with HOA infrastructure and threatening legal action if he continued to obstruct the use of the community parking lot. The letter included a copy of what they claimed was a property line map, and it was wrong. It showed the parking lot entirely on what it said was HOA land. Jean knew that map had to have come from the developer, and he knew it was incorrect, but seeing it in official-looking letterhead made his stomach go tight. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was becoming something more. This was the HOA deciding they were going to make their mistake official and dare him to prove them wrong. If this story's got you hooked, share it and subscribe to the HOA Trap, because what this old man pulls out of the county records office is about to change everything. That night, Jean sat alone in his living room. Pearl had gone to bed around 9, like she always did, heading upstairs with her cup of chamomile tea and her mystery novel. And he looked at that letter and felt something he didn't want to feel: frustration, exhaustion, the kind of weariness that comes when you've done nothing wrong and people are treating you like you have. He was 71 years old. He didn't have energy for a legal battle. He didn't have the patience for lawyers and courts and paperwork. He was a farmer, not a fighter. He'd spent his life working, building, maintaining. He'd never sued anybody. He'd never been sued before. He wanted to fix his fence and move on, wanted to get back to his routines, wanted to not have to think about parking lots and property lines and lawyers. Instead, he was sitting here in his leather chair, the one he'd bought 15 years ago and that had molded to his shape over time, reading threats from people who'd made a mistake and now wanted to pretend they hadn't made it. The letter sat on his lap, formal and cold, and Jean read it again just to make sure he understood what he was reading, and he did understand. They were telling him to stay away from his own property. They were telling him they had lawyers and they would use them. They were telling him that he was the problem. He thought about just giving up, about calling a lawyer and letting that lawyer handle it, letting some professional take over and fight the fight while he sat back and waited for it to be over. But something held him back, something that said, "No, you know the truth about this land, and you've got proof of it, and you don't need a lawyer right now to win this one. You need a piece of paper that's 76 years old, a piece of paper that nobody can argue with because it's official and it's been kept safe all these years. That piece of paper still exists. It's sitting in the Madison County courthouse, filed away with all the other records of property and ownership that make the whole legal system work. That piece of paper is going to tell the truth about where the boundary is, and no amount of asphalt or threatening letters can change what's written on it. All he had to do was go get it. All he had to do was let people know that the truth was on his side. And then, if he had to get a lawyer, he'd get a lawyer. But he wouldn't need one until he knew for sure what the truth was. The next morning, Gene didn't say anything to Pearl about what he was going to do. He just drank his coffee as usual, ate some eggs and toast that Pearl made him, and then he got in his truck and drove into town, out to the county courthouse in Madison. The drive took about 30 minutes, heading south through the Georgia countryside, past fields and pine forests and small houses that had been built in the 50s and 60s and still looked like they were home to people who cared for them. The courthouse was a brick building from the 1950s, 3 stories tall, with columns out front and a dome on top, cool and official smelling inside, with that particular smell that old government buildings have, a mix of floor wax and old paper and the weight of history. Gene made his way through the hallways, following signs until he found the records office, a room that seemed to be buried in the basement, with metal filing cabinets lining the walls and windows set high up, so you could see the feet of people walking by on the street above. The woman behind the counter was young, maybe 30, with friendly eyes and the kind of patience that comes from working in a place where people often don't know what they're looking for. Gene explained what he needed, and the young woman asked him whose property and what year exactly. She smiled. She seemed like the helpful type, and asked him whose property and what year exactly. Gene gave her his grandfather's name and the property description, and she smiled and said she'd be happy to help. She went into a back room where they kept the older documents, the ones that didn't get much request but still had to be kept careful because they were the foundation of everything. Property ownership, boundary lines, all the legal proof that this land belongs to this family and not that family. She came out about 5 minutes later with a manila folder, carefully preserved, and she said, "This is the filing. It's in pretty good shape for its age. A lot of these old maps get brittle, but this one's been stored well." She opened it carefully, the way you'd open something old and precious, and there it was. The original plat map, hand-drawn on cream-colored paper that had turned a little golden with age, showing the 85 acres of Wilkins land with all the boundaries marked clear as day, the property lines drawn in careful black ink, the sort of handwriting that you don't see anymore, deliberate and precise. The surveyor's name and signature at the bottom, a man named Harold Pritchard, certified county surveyor, and the county clerk's stamp from October of 1947 in red ink. It was beautiful in a way. It was proof. It was history. It was the thing Gene had always known was true, but now he could hold it in his hands and look at it, could trace his finger along the boundary lines and see exactly where his family's property began and where it ended. The map showed not just his land, but the surrounding properties, marked with the names of neighboring landowners from over 70 years ago. It was a snapshot of time, preserved on paper. Gene asked if he could make a copy of it, and the young woman said, of course, she'd make copies for him. She made him 3, one for his records, one to keep handy for reference, and one to give to someone if he needed to. The copying machine was old, one of those heavy machines from the 80s, and it took a minute to warm up, and then it hummed and clicked as it ran the original through, producing copies that were clean and clear. Gene watched the copies come out, one after another, the same information his grandfather had paid for 76 years earlier, now in 3 separate physical forms. He thanked the young woman warmly, paid the copying fee, it was only a few dollars, and walked back out into the Georgia sun, feeling like he'd just picked up a weapon that wasn't a weapon at all, but was better than a weapon. It was just a piece of paper. But it was a piece of paper that told the truth, and that truth was old enough that nobody could argue with it. It was signed and stamped. It was official. It was proof. Next thing Gene did was call a county surveyor. He found the number in an old phone book at home, a man named Robert Caldwell, who'd been doing surveying work in Madison County for about 30 years. Gene called him up and said, "Mr. Caldwell, I need you to come out to my property and verify some boundary lines for me. I've got an old plat map from 1947, and I've got a situation where someone's built on my land. Caldwell said he'd be happy to do it, and they set up a time for the following Tuesday. Tuesday came, and Caldwell showed up mid-morning in a white truck that had his company name painted on the side and all his surveying equipment stored in the bed. He was a straightforward man, gray-haired, probably in his 60s, the kind of professional who didn't waste time on small talk or pleasantries. He just got to work. Gene showed him the property, walked him the boundary, showed him the asphalt lot that shouldn't be there, and showed him the original plat map. Caldwell studied the map for a while, standing in the middle of the property with the map held steady in his hands, looking from the map to the landscape and back again. Then he set up his equipment, a transit and measuring rod, and a notebook for recording his findings. He used his instruments to verify the old survey markers, what he could find of them, some of which were buried or obscured by time and weather. And he ran his own complete survey, walking the boundary with his instruments, taking measurements, checking angles. He planted new markers to show exactly where the property line was, using metal stakes with his professional seal stamped on them, just like the old ones from 1947. It took him about 3 hours, working methodically, not rushing, the way professionals work when they're doing something that matters. When he was done, he came back to Gene standing by the edge of the asphalt and said, "Mr. Wilkins, I'll tell you exactly what I found. Your property line runs here." And he pointed to a line that was approximately 8 feet north of the asphalt, which meant the entire parking lot was on Gene's property. Not part of it, all of it, 100% of it. Every single parking space, every inch of that asphalt. Caldwell said, "That 1947 survey was well done. Whoever did that work knew what they were doing. The boundary's clear. I've planted new markers every 50 feet along the line, so it's documented now. You can get a formal report from me, with all my measurements and calculations and my professional seal, and you'll have documentation of the boundary as it exists today. No one can argue with this. The math doesn't lie." Gene thanked him proper, with a firm handshake and a nod, and Caldwell gave him the formal report bound in a cover, with the surveyor's seal embossed on it and Caldwell's signature on every page, making it official and legal. Gene paid him his fee, which was $600, and it seemed like money well spent, and Gene watched him drive away in his white truck, heading back to whatever other surveys waited for him in Madison County. Now Gene had 2 pieces of evidence. The original 1947 plat map from the county courthouse, 76 years old, the work of surveyor Harold Pritchard, bearing the county clerk's stamp, and a current survey from a certified surveyor named Robert Caldwell, confirming that the map was accurate and the parking lot was entirely on Gene's land. 2 pieces of truth, separated by nearly 8 decades, saying the same thing. The boundary was here. The parking lot was there. They didn't match. The HOA had built on Gene's land. If you're watching the HOA Trap right now, hit that like button. It's free, takes 1 second, and it helps this story reach more folks who've had to deal with people building on land that wasn't theirs. Now, back to the story. Gene called the HOA and left a message on their office line asking for a meeting with the board. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He kept his tone calm and professional, the way he did when he was dealing with something important. He just said he had some documents that he wanted to discuss regarding the parking lot, and he requested a time when the board could meet with him. He said he was available any evening that week. They called back the next day, and their secretary scheduled him for the following Thursday evening at 7 o'clock at the community center. Gene confirmed the time, thanked her, and hung up. Thursday night. That gave him 3 days to get ready, to make sure all his documents were in order, to think through what he was going to say. Gene showed up about 30 minutes early, which was his way. Always arrive early, don't keep people waiting, but also give yourself time to settle and think. He had the original plat map in a protective folder, along with 3 copies, and he had the surveyor's report bound and ready, the pages crisp and official. Pearl had offered to come with him, but Gene said no, this was something he needed to do alone. He drove to the community center with the windows down, even though the evening was warm, clearing his head, thinking about what he was going to say. The community center was a nice enough building, modern, built in brick and glass, with a parking lot in front full of cars. Some of those cars, Gene thought, parked where they shouldn't be. The meeting was being held in a conference room on the 2nd floor, a room with a long table and chairs and a whiteboard on the wall. Board members were already there when Gene arrived, sitting around the table, looking at some kind of agenda. There was Davis, the president, who nodded at Gene in a friendly enough way, seeming relieved to see him, like he'd been dreading this but was willing to hear what Gene had to say. There were 3 other board members Gene didn't know well. They looked middle-aged, professional, the sort of people who'd moved to the community to retire or semi-retire and thought being on the HOA board would be an interesting project. And there was Karen Wexler, sitting with her clipboard, her face already set in an expression that suggested she wasn't expecting to hear anything she wanted to hear, her jaw tense, her eyes skeptical. Davis opened the meeting by asking Gene what he wanted to discuss. Gene stood up slowly, the way he did when he had something important to say, giving himself a moment to gather his thoughts, to remember what he needed to communicate. He said, "Well, I appreciate you making time for me on a Thursday night. I'm sure you all have things you'd rather be doing. I'm here because there's been a significant boundary misunderstanding regarding the parking lot that's been constructed on the southern side of my property. Now, I'm not here to yell or to make accusations or to point fingers. I'm just here because there's a problem, and I think you need to know what it is. I want to show you some documents that might help clarify things, and then maybe we can figure out what the best way to fix this is." He opened the folder and took out the original plat map. He walked it over to the table and laid it down careful, like it was made of glass. He said, "This is the original property survey for my land, conducted by County Surveyor Harold Pritchard in October of 1947. It shows the boundary line of my property. The parking lot your HOA constructed is built on the southern side of this line, which means it's built on my land, not yours." Karen started to say something, but Gene kept going. He said, "Now, I also had a current survey done by County Surveyor Robert Caldwell last week. He confirmed that the original survey was accurate, and he planted new boundary markers to verify the location." He laid out the surveyor's report. "The report confirms that the parking lot is 100% located on my property. Not part of it, all of it, every space." Davis leaned forward and looked at the plat map. His face went a little pale. One of the other board members started asking questions about the survey, real questions, the kind of questions a reasonable person asks when they've just realized they've made an expensive mistake. Karen started arguing. She said the developer had assured them the land was available, that Gene must be mistaken, that the map could be misinterpreted. Gene just looked at her. He said, "Ma'am, there's not much to misinterpret about a map and a name. My family's name is right here. The boundary is right here. The surveyor's signature is right here. And Mr. Caldwell, who's a certified county surveyor with 30 years of experience, has verified this with his own instruments. The parking lot was built on my property. That's not an interpretation. That's a fact." The room went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when people are realizing they've done something very wrong, and now they have to figure out how to fix it. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the sound of the air conditioning, someone's phone buzzing in a pocket. But nobody spoke for a full 10 seconds, and 10 seconds is a long time when nobody's talking. Davis said finally, "Mr. Wilkins, I apologize. We made an assumption we shouldn't have made. The developer told us the land was clear to build on. We should have verified that ourselves. I don't know what we're going to do about this, but we certainly need to make it right. This is..." He shook his head, looking at the plat map again. "This is significant. This is a serious problem, and I'm sorry." Karen said, "The developer is responsible for this, not us." Gene just looked at her and said, "Maybe, but the parking lot is on my property, and that's a fact regardless of who's responsible. You can sort out who pays for what between yourselves. What matters to me is that my property line is restored, my fence is rebuilt, and the land is back the way it was before someone poured asphalt on it." They talked for another hour. Davis was trying to figure out next steps, asking if Gene would let them try to negotiate with the developer, asking what it would take to make this right. Gene told him the answer was simple: tear up the parking lot, haul away the asphalt, restore the fence, and pay for the surveyor's work and his time dealing with this mess. Beyond that, he said, he'd have to talk to a lawyer. If the HOA Trap has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple bucks a month keeps these stories coming. Links below. Now, back to the story. It took about 6 weeks for the HOA to tear up the parking lot. 6 long weeks of negotiation and argument and lawyers sending back and forth letters about responsibility and liability. But in the end, the HOA had no choice. The evidence was clear. The surveyor's report was clear. The old plat map was clear. Every legal argument they tried failed. The developer sued the HOA, saying the HOA should have verified the property. And the HOA sued the contractor, saying the contractor should have verified the property. But nobody could argue with the fact that the parking lot was on Gene's land and had to come up. That process of tearing it up was something to see. The construction company that had poured the asphalt in the first place came back, unwilling but ordered to do it, with heavy equipment and jackhammered up every bit of the surface. The sound of that jackhammer was almost like music to Gene, the sound of his land being restored to him. They hauled it away in trucks, big loads of broken asphalt that got trucked to a recycling facility in Atlanta. The process made a tremendous noise and an enormous mess of dust that hung in the air, settling on the trees and the grass, and Gene's property looked like a war zone for a while, with torn up earth and ruts from the equipment and the smell of diesel fuel and broken concrete. But by the end of it, the asphalt was gone, every bit of it. There was raw earth where the lot used to be, red clay torn up and exposed, and that raw earth belonged to Gene Wilkins, and nobody could take it from him. What happened to Karen was that she quietly stepped down from her board position about a week after that meeting. She sent in a letter of resignation, said she was stepping back for personal reasons, and that was the last Gene heard about it. Gene didn't ask for details, didn't really care to know the politics of it, whether the other board members had forced her out, or whether she just decided she couldn't defend a losing position anymore. What mattered was that she was gone, and the board had decided to focus on fixing things instead of arguing about them. Karen's voice was no longer in the room saying that Gene was wrong, that the map could be misinterpreted, that the developer wasn't responsible. The developer that had built the subdivision, meanwhile, ended up in a lawsuit with the HOA because the developer had provided inaccurate information about available land. The developer claimed they had relied on surveys provided by the county, which turned out to be wrong, and the HOA countered that a competent developer would have verified the information independently. It got messy. There were lawyers and depositions and all sorts of legal back and forth. Gene didn't have to be part of that lawsuit, and he wanted nothing to do with the legal mess. He had what he cared about: his property back, his fence about to be restored, his land about to be returned to him exactly the way it should have been all along. The HOA paid for the damages. They had no choice. Their lawyer and Gene's lawyer, he'd finally hired one after the meeting to make sure everything was done proper, worked out a settlement that covered everything. They paid for a new fence, similar to the one that had been torn down. Gene helped oversee the work because he wanted it done right. He'd built the original fence himself, and while he wouldn't have been able to rebuild it at his age, his hands weren't as strong as they used to be. His back couldn't take the strain of setting posts in concrete all day. He could make sure whoever did it built it solid and true. A company from Madison came out with a crew of 3 men, and they worked from Gene's surveyor's markers, placing new posts exactly where the old ones had been, using treated timber that would last just as long as the original. Gene watched them work, sitting under a shade tree with a glass of sweet tea that Pearl brought out, making sure every post was set right, every wire was pulled taut, every fastener was secure. The fence went up over the course of 2 weeks, new posts every 10 feet, new wires strung between them, new tension and support, the whole thing solid and strong. It wasn't identical to the old fence. It couldn't be. Not after 30 years. Things change, materials change, techniques change. But it was a good, strong fence, strong enough to last another 30 years, and it ran along the exact property line that a surveyor had verified. When it was done, Gene walked it, running his hand along the new wire, checking every post, making sure it was worthy of standing on his land. The HOA also planted new survey markers, officially marked at the boundary by a professional surveyor, so there would never be confusion about where the line was again. They used markers that were bright and visible, and they registered them with the county so there would be an official record of their placement. It cost the HOA quite a bit of money by the time everything was settled. Beyond the fence and the markers, they had to pay the surveyor's fee, which was another $600, cover legal costs. Lawyers don't come cheap. pay the contractor for the removal of the asphalt, and write Gene a check for damages and for his time and frustration dealing with the situation. Gene didn't ask for an unreasonable amount. He didn't ask for $100,000 or anything crazy like that. But he also didn't accept a lowball offer. He hired his own lawyer to negotiate, and they settled on $50,000. Money for the fence, money for the surveyor's work, money for his time and trouble, money for the inconvenience of having his property line violated and having to spend months dealing with the mess. He knew what his trouble was worth, and he made sure they paid it. By November, you wouldn't have known a parking lot had ever been there. The raw earth had settled, and Gene planted some native grasses and small trees along the southern boundary, both to stabilize the soil and to create a natural barrier between his property and the subdivision. He was careful about the placement, making sure the trees weren't planted in a way that would overstep the boundary line. He used native species, birch and pine and oak, the kind of trees that belonged in Georgia, that would grow strong and provide shade and beauty. It took a few seasons for the trees to establish, a couple years, and Gene watered them during the dry spells and watched them grow inch by inch. But after a couple years, if you didn't know the parking lot had been there, if you walked that southern boundary, you wouldn't be able to tell that there had ever been asphalt and marked spaces and cars parked where they shouldn't have been. Nature has a way of covering up mistakes if you give it time, of healing wounds, of moving forward. The trees grew tall enough that they started to shade the boundary, and the grass came in thick, and the natural world reasserted itself over the place where concrete and asphalt had briefly tried to claim dominion. Gene and Pearl walked that fence line one morning in late spring, about a year after all the trouble had been resolved. The morning was clear and cool, the way Georgia mornings can be before the heat sets in, and there was the smell of fresh grass and pine sap in the air. The new fence was solid and strong, already weathered a bit by a year of sun and rain. The survey markers were in place and visible. The boundary was secure and marked and official. Pearl slipped her arm through Gene's, the way she'd been doing for 43 years, and she said, "You did good, Gene. You did real good." Gene just nodded. He wasn't one for talking about himself much, for bragging or making a big deal out of his own accomplishments, but he was proud, in a quiet way, of how he'd handled it. He'd been tested, and he'd done the right thing. He hadn't lost his temper. He hadn't rushed into things. He hadn't acted mean or vindictive. He'd gone and found the truth, a truth that had been written down 76 years ago by a man named Harold Pritchard, and he'd let that truth speak for itself. The numbers didn't lie. The boundaries were clear. The marker stakes were proof. The old plat map was proof, and in the end, proof was what mattered. Life went back to normal at the farm after that. Gene had his routines, morning coffee on the porch, sometimes with Pearl, sometimes alone, looking out at the land and making sure everything was the way it should be, checking the fence lines, walking the property to see if anything needed maintenance or repair, maintaining the property the way he'd always done it. He spent time with his grandkids when they came to visit, taking them on walks, teaching them things about the land, about how to take care of things that matter to you. The Whispering Pines subdivision continued on. People came and went. The community center continued to have events. The pool continued to be popular. Eventually, the HOA got a new board and a new direction, a new president who was more careful about things, who understood that you had to verify property lines before you built anything. Gene never had occasion to be bothered by them again. The boundary was clear. The fence was there. The survey markers were planted. His land was his land, documented and verified and protected by paper that was older than he was, by stakes in the ground that nobody would dare move, by a fence that stood as a physical reminder that Gene Wilkins knew where his property ended. The thing that stuck with people who knew Gene, and word got around, the way it does in rural communities, was that he'd solved the problem without yelling, without hiring a fancy lawyer right off the bat, without making it personal. He'd simply gone and found the evidence of what was true, and he'd let that evidence do the work. In the end, it wasn't anger or confrontation that won the day. It was a piece of paper from 1947 and a man who understood that some things are more valuable than any amount of asphalt or argument. Gene passed away about 4 years after all this happened. He was 75 by then, still working on the property as much as he could, still checking the fence lines, still maintaining the land the way his father had maintained it and his grandfather had maintained it before that. His heart just gave out one afternoon while he was sitting in his leather chair in the living room, the light from the windows falling across his lap, which was probably how he would have wanted it, quiet and at home on his own land. His will left the property to his oldest boy, the same boy who'd helped him build the fence all those years ago, when he was a teenager with strong arms and the whole future ahead of him. And his oldest boy kept it exactly the way Gene had kept it, because that's what you do when you inherit land that your grandfather bought after World War II, scraping together money from a factory job that your father protected and improved, and that your old man stood up for when somebody tried to take it. You keep it, you honor it, you make sure the boundaries stay where they're supposed to be. You make sure that if anybody ever tries to build something where they shouldn't, they know they're going to find a property owner who knows his land better than anybody else knows anything. The original plat map from 1947 is now framed in his boy's house, right over the living room mantel, a reminder that sometimes the best arguments aren't arguments at all. They're just the truth, preserved on paper and filed away in official records, waiting for someone with the sense to look for it. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you that a piece of paper from 1947 can be worth more than a parking lot full of concrete, share it. Subscribe to the HOA Trap for more stories about folks who knew their land better than anyone who tried to take it. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you found fresh asphalt where your fence used to be?